Hi, everybody. My name is Jared McCormick. I am a clinical assistant professor here at the Kevorkian Center. Wanted to welcome you back for the Border and Infrastructure Elements series. This is the first event in the spring, and we are delighted to have such esteemed guests. I just wanted to start by saying this meeting will be recorded, and it will be up on our YouTube shortly. Someone from the Kevorkian Center will be putting links into the chat for the other events that are coming soon. So for those of you that have joined us, you know that this is, again, for better or worse, a Zoom series of events. And what we're trying to do here, we're taking elements as they relate to time, space, borders, movement, affect, and different disciplines, how they approach this. And we're trying to form conversational events. And so this is the water number 2. In the fall, we had the 4 kind of classic elements. And so the spring represents take 2, a different perspective, a different handful of guests. And so without further ado, let me just do a quick introduction of the panelists, and we will be posting a larger bio in the chat so that you can follow up with them, research them. Appearing in the order that they'll be speaking here is Jatin Dua, Laleh Khalili, Nathalie Peutz, and Atossa Abrahamian, who will be the discussant. I just wanted to also encourage everyone, as the event goes along, if you have any questions, feel free to type those into the chat and we'll get to them. And the last 20 or 30 minutes, we'll open it up. You can unmute yourself. You can continue to write comments in the chat. You can also direct message anyone, any of the co-hosts. So without further ado, welcome everyone. And Jatin, I'll have you take it away.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you all for being here. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be amidst in the company of Laleh and Nathalie and others whose work I've really admired and thought through in my own. Today, I want to speak about ships at sea, and in particular, some of both the biggest ships at sea as well as some of the smallest boats. And the ways they can help us think about relationships to water and ways of making claims to water. From rusty fishing skiffs to lumbering supertankers, millions of vessels and millions of seafarers currently traverse liquid paths across the globe. Many have written eloquently of the singular importance of oceanic routes and rhythms in shaping the contemporary world with its inequalities and occasional opportunities. To go to sea is at some level fundamentally to embrace peril. The pitch and roll of ships can make one seasick. Boats break, ships get swallowed whole by a devouring ocean. Fellow crew members and captains can be troubled. The perils are, however, unevenly felt. A fishing skiff is not a container ship, and certainly not the naval destroyer policing restive waters, hypervisible, yet invisible on automatic identification systems and other shipboard navigation instruments. And sometimes pirates appear, though often in the guise of protectors. At the beginning of the 20th century, the eulogy for the pirate had already been written. A mythic figure, the pirate was at this point a vestige of a prior time. In the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, European empires had used the specter of piracy, and often pirates in the form of privateers, to establish imperial monopolies. Once in place, privateers either became colonial administrators and governors, or were transformed into enemies of all mankind and hunted down in global anti-piracy manhunts. The age of steam heralded not only the triumph of coal over wind, but also the Navy over the pirate. When the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas was being debated, defining pirates and piracy was understood as moot and a bit anachronistic. The real battle was about territorializing the sea, for accessing its resources, whether that be fish or deep sea mining. However, in 2008, the world was once again abuzz with pirates and piracy. Off the coast of Somalia, an unprecedented upsurge had led to a global attention and, importantly, an armada of navies. Armed with UN mandates, global navies patrolled international waters, territorial waters, and even land and did what many claimed was a form of protection. We're protectors of the ocean, they would say, protectors of global trade and even the freedom of navigation. This claim of protection by military might has a long history. And in the Indian Ocean, from 2008 onwards, it transformed into multi-year missions and the establishment of ad hoc criminal courts across the littoral, and as well as training militaries, navies, and other forces in the region. This was not just a Euro-American story. Navies from India, Iran, China, and the UAE also laid claim to this maritime space. In a transit in 2010, when I was doing research for my book, we had at least 4 different navies hail us from the moment we left the Suez till we ended up in Jebel Ali. And they were, at one point it was the Iranian Navy, at another point it was a NATO warship, at another point an Indian vessel, all sort of, claiming basically to check in on these ships and these cargo ships that were going in, and often talking always in this language of protection. But navies do not have a monopoly on protection, even if they have the biggest guns at sea. Pirates, too, claimed to be protectors of the ocean. In the 1990s, before all the media attention, local fishermen off the coast of Somalia were transforming themselves into coast guards, sometimes trained by the EU, charging protection rents from fishing trawlers and others who came to feed the world's growing appetite for tuna, snapper, and other piscine delights. Over the years, this process scaled up and focused on a different kind of fish, namely the cargo ships that traversed this region. Pirates would call themselves protectors of the sea and use this language to make claims on these mobile objects. But this form of protection was one that drew on a different vocabulary, a vocabulary of sovereignty that flowed not through territorial flags only or imperial ambitions, but often horizontally in idioms of hospitality and hosting, of notions of aman and aban, practices of giving and receiving protection for strangers. In this way, pirates and navies encountered each other at sea. Piracy then, as my research has argued, was an encounter between these multiple regimes of protection. This is reflected in the fact that, unlike other places, ships were hijacked in the Western Indian Ocean, not for their cargo, but for the value that emerged through negotiation. The moment of capture marked the beginning and not an end of a social relationship. Instead of an art of not being governed, capture at sea that inaugurated piracy was a form of connectivity and an entree into a world constituted by protection and an incredible plurality of actors. A successful hijacking then required not only the capture of a ship, but also a form of agreement of protection, however tenuous and forced across these disparate worlds. Protection thus is both an analytic and methodology to understand multiple forms of claim-making at sea, multiple forms of claim-making over objects. It is a way to understand the divides and domaining that happen, that divide worlds into legality and illegality, into land and sea, into history and anthropology, and that separate the world of piracy and counter-piracy. It allows us to ask, who is a pirate after all, and where is piracy? So what I'm claiming is not that everyone is in the protection business at sea, though of course at a certain level that is what was happening. These claims of protection as articulated by navies are fundamentally different from the ones that pirates made claims to. One comes in with naval destroyers, with flags, with empires, another with negotiations, with these attempts to transform into legitimate protectors. But thinking through this commonality, thinking through this way of piracy as a mode of protection, as a way of claiming things at sea through a language of an idiom of protection, is not only to query the lines that divide worlds into legal and illegal, but also to make visible the various kinds of things and people and objects and forces that lurk behind this naval vessel and the pirate skiff, right? Instead of simply a localized encounter between two vessels at sea, piracy is about a plurality of actors, many of whom never cross the border of land and enter sea. Behind naval vessels, one very quickly sees insurance companies and states, legal advisors, ransom negotiators, and others who all sought to make claims on the profits of piracy. Similarly, behind pirate skiffs were cath dealers, traders, scholars, and others who also made claims on pirates and often never went to sea. So while this may seem like a distant world, the encounter of overlapping regimes of protection is one that reminds us of the slippages between the protection of piracy and the protection of navies, but also the visible and invisible ways in which claims to the ocean are made possible by many who remain either on land or stuck outside the kind of limelight. And I just, as a way to spur our conversation, I want to think about what it may mean to make claims on the sea and who gets to make claims on the sea, and ask, who is legible and who is invisibilized in when we focus on what happens at sea versus what happens on land. So in a way, it is to ask, if one of the provocations for today was to ask how are claims made to water, one way perhaps maybe is to, by never actually leaving land itself. So I'll just leave there, and I guess, Laleh, pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jatin. And I also want to thank everyone at Kevo for inviting me. It's so lovely to be seeing so many people, and then looking down the list of participants and seeing so many people that I want to say hello to individually. So thank you for being here, and thank you for the invitation. Okay, Watery Borders. Like all other US military branches, the remit, an area of operations of the US Coast Guard, has expanded dramatically, even exponentially, since the end of the Cold War. It is perhaps worth noting that the US Coast Guard now has 21 attachés attached to embassies overseas, and whereas their website blandly states maritime operations play a significant role. As Jeffrey Kahn has written in his extraordinary book about Haiti, Islands of Sovereignty, the US Coast Guard cutters, which intercept migrants on their way to the US, enact the US border far from the actual watery lines drawn on the map, which delimit US sovereignty at sea. The US has justified its imperial milieu in the Caribbean via the Monroe Doctrine for a century and a half now. But the US Coast Guard also operates far away from the Western Hemisphere. US offshoring of its Coast Guard activities follows on other forms of distant bordering. One can cross US borders in airports in Toronto or Shannon or Abu Dhabi. But the presence of the Coast Guard in Bahrain and other significant seafaring locales also speaks to an older tradition of defining sovereign milieus far from the metropole. The strategic planning document of the Coast Guard admits as much. The Coast Guard is intended to operate in the context of, and I quote, the vastness, anonymity, and inherent challenges of governance over the maritime domain, which make it vulnerable to dangerous threats, including transnational crime, terrorist activity, illegal exploitation of natural resources, and territorial expansionism. This comes from the Coast Guard's strategic document. The US Coast Guard began establishing overseas beachheads and infrastructures after the start of the War on Terror. More recently, Iran and Department of Home Security gaming scenarios for the Coast Guard drawn up in 2020 include such things as oil spills, pandemics and quarantines, natural disasters, and interdiction of illicit drugs. These gaming scenarios highlight crisis circumstances around the globe where the Coast Guard would intervene. Perhaps the only difference between these modalities of or alibis for maritime expansion is that in empires past, it was the Navy that went forth. Today, the US littoral guarded by the Coast Guard is defined in whichever maritime space where US forces have a presence. And US forces, as we know, are everywhere. I mentioned the case of the US Coast Guard operating halfway across the world because it highlights two particular characteristics of the oceans. First, the durably reproduced idea that the seas are outside territorial spaces or that they are indivisible. And second, it is precisely the divisibility of the sea, its vulnerability to sovereign dominion, that makes the seas the object of the US Coast Guard's presence in places where we don't envision the US shorelines to be. In some senses, these two propositions are contradictory because the first argues that the idea of the indivisibility of the sea has to be produced, whereas the second avers that in practice, this indivisibility is constantly violated. And of course, unequal global power lays at the root of both these propositions. Let me begin with the reproduction of the idea of indivisibility. Grotius is usually cited as the year zero of maritime sovereignty, of the idea of maritime sovereignty, despite the intentionally duplicitous name of his theory of the freedom of the seas, or mare liberum. But mare liberum is fascinating because not only does it say that the sea is free, but that it is free to those who can occupy it by force. It is a version of terra nullius, but nautical, and it is echoed in Grotius's laws of price, which similarly juridically underwrite the powerful's right to appropriate what they want. But the idea of divisibility and indivisibility play out in other interesting ways in his juridical writings as well. For Grotius, littoral sovereigns in Asia have divisible power, power that can be delegated, and can, or arguably should, he argued, delegate some of that power to the Europeans who were arriving on their coasts from the 15th century onwards. The freedom of the seas is a principle that has also been fought over in the post-colonial era. Interestingly, the North Atlantic maritime powers wanted to insist on limiting sovereign expansion of post-colonial states into the sea to only 3 nautical miles, while the post-colonial states wanted a much wider ribbon of control on their borders. This was in part because the North Atlantic maritime powers reserved to themselves the ability to steam close to the coasts of newly decolonized maritime states. Similarly, the sea could be said to be a resource held in common, but in the immediate post-colonial era, it was clear to the newly decolonized states that what lay beneath the waters, even near to their shore, could be claimed by a state whose coasts were half a world away. It needed not have been a state that called itself an empire, nor the regime of rule needed to be formally colonial. The enactment of such sovereign control over subsea resources, far from the border of the former imperial states, often occurred most successfully through the body of corporations with headquarters in the imperial metropoles and their concessions beneath the waters of faraway countries, usually concessions for oil, but other kinds of subsea resources as well. As many of the early anti-colonial strugglers knew, these concessions were fragments of sovereignty delegated to European powers by colonial or semi-colonial states, the power of whose rulers was wholly divisible. That in the post-colonial era, despite the niceties of many an international treaty supposedly declaring the oceans and their subsea bounties a common resource, arbitral tribunals would inevitably rule on behalf of corporations that were the post-colonial face of former colonizers. And this perhaps says something about all the institutions that enact neocolonial policies. This brings us back to the Coast Guard. As I said earlier, the strategic plans of the Coast Guard sees its operations and working across the globe as necessary to the maintenance of US power, economic well-being, and global formal and informal dominion. As Charmaine Chua has shown, containment of movement of goods and cargo and humans is as central to the liberal order of things in late capitalism as their movement is. So both holding them their immobility and their mobility are used to attenuate the power of the others and increase the power of the metropole. Thus, it is no surprise that the highest concentration of Coast Guard attachés are billeted to Caribbean countries where the Monroe Doctrine held sway. Beyond that, in Bahrain, the US Coast Guard has most often been involved in interdicting Iranian ships in search of phantom or real infractions against the US borders so far out to sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next we have Nathalie. And Nathalie, you're still muted. One second, we'll check in on that.
There.
Give it a try now. Okay.
Okay. And you can see my screen blank? Thanks.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I'm also very grateful to those who've worked to make this possible. And it's really a delight to share the screen with Jatin and Laleh and Atossa. And thank you everyone for being here today. So I was thinking about this provocation and it made me think about how to actually address this. My first book traced the development of an environmental conservation regime in Yemen's Socotra archipelago in the 2000s, or what pastoralists refer to as the arrival of the environment. My second project looks at Yemenis encamped in Djibouti. And so while these projects may seem to be quite distinct, they both look at political, economic, and social developments within Yemen from across the sea, from Socotra, 240 miles south of the Arabian Peninsula, and from Obok, a port town in northern Djibouti, about 60 miles west. Drawing on this view from the other coast, to paraphrase Aung San Suu Kyi, as it were, I will discuss my interlocutors' experience of the sea as an ambiguous space and a liminal one, as both a threat and a refuge, a peril and a promise, a definitive border, and a permeable one. 1 second. Okay, so in March 2015, Ali Abdullah Saleh warned his opponents that they had had few avenues for refuge or escape. Those fleeing to Aden, as they did in 1994 during the Civil War, will find only one exit, which is the Red Sea towards Djibouti. Saleh was taunting Yemen's current president, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, who in the wake of the Houthi takeover of government had just escaped from Sana'a to Aden. Nevertheless, thousands of Yemenis and foreign nationals would soon find themselves fleeing the country via the only exit available to them across the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Caught in the fighting between the Houthi pro-Saleh militias on the one hand and the pro-Hadi resistance on the other, and fearful of the Saudi-led coalition's airstrikes raining down from above, civilians fled from one neighborhood to another, or if they could, to the nearest ports. Since Saleh's warning, more than 4 million Yemenis have been forced to flee their homes. Most are displaced within Yemen's borders, making Yemen the country with the 4th largest number of internally displaced persons. Those who had the means and opportunity to depart Yemen joined relatives and friends in the diaspora or sought asylum in the MENA and Europe. Others displaced by the fighting and the airstrikes in Western Yemen fled to neighboring Djibouti and Somaliland and stayed, having been recognized there as refugees on a prima facie basis. By the end of 2016, more than 36,000 people had escaped to and via Djibouti, the only country that erected a camp specifically for refugees from Yemen. At present, this Markazi camp houses 1,500 refugees, many of whom identify as biracial due to their Eritrean, Ethiopian, or Somali roots. My interlocutors in the camp describe having been pushed to the sea, directly as they were evacuating their villages, or indirectly due to the closure of Yemen's airspace and land borders. Many voiced their anger at having been caught up in the conflicts between regional and global powers more interested in their control of the Red Sea than in the futures of those eking out a living on its torrid coasts. In other words, they claim to have been pushed to the sea, not only because this waterway was the only accessible exit from Yemen, but also because it was the geostrategic value of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that drew Iranian, British, and US arms to Yemen in the first place. Despite Djibouti's blanket recognition of all Yemenis claiming asylum, many of the Yemenis in the camp are anxious about their refugee status. Early on, various Yemeni officials and their Djiboutian counterparts took to calling these Yemenis displaced, nazihin, rather than refugees, laji'in. When the Yemeni ambassador to Djibouti visited the camp in January 2017, he tried to assure the refugees that they were nazihin, displaced under Yemeni care and protection, who would soon be able to return to their homeland. The UNHCR says we are refugees, but they call us refugee, but they call us displaced, nazihin, as if we've just moved from one city to the next, a young man told me that afternoon. But we crossed the sea, he stressed, suggesting that this protracted border crossing, and with it his transformation from citizen to refugee, was or should have been definitive. Instead, with the Hadi government casting the net of internal displacement across the shores of the Red Sea, the refugees living in Markazi felt stifled by the state's extraterritorial grip. This alarm was compounded by the opening of the Saudi village within the confines of the camp in 2018. Many who yearn for third country resettlement feared that if they were to move physically from their impermanent tents to the air-conditioned container units donated by Saudi Arabia, they would be moving jurisdictionally from the tent of UN international protection to the de facto prison of permanent displacement. They also worry that the comings and goings of their fellow camp residents will dilute their own chances for third country resettlement. This is because just 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is not proving to be the absolute border some refugees wish it to be. It is the same sea that constituted Yemenis as refugees that continues to connect them to their family and businesses in Yemen. In January 2017, during the coalition's efforts to recapture the Red Sea towns from the Houthis, the sounds of the bombs dropping on Yemen's coast reached the refugees before their relatives' WhatsApp messages did. Even now, many refugees continue to return to Yemen for weddings, funerals, medical treatment, business, or just to check on their homes. Many have returned and joined militias for pay. Several who have returned have lost their lives. It was the sea crossing that had constituted the Yemenis as refugees, an ascendant status that they had hoped would provide them onward passage to the global north, while also giving a name to their sense of alienation at home. But it is their encampment on the shore, just across the sea from Yemen, that threatens to lap away at their international protection. Now, a Socotra friend used to tell me that he felt imprisoned by the sea. And historically, Socotra had been isolated during the summer monsoon when the sea was too rough for dhows to berth in its shallow harbors. During these 4 months, Socotrans had subsisted on grains, dates, and livestock that they had stockpiled and endured repeated bouts of hunger. The extension of Hadibo's airstrip at the turn of the 21st century resulted in a sea change for the islanders, allowing Socotrans to travel to the mainland for employment, education, and medical care year-round. Still, even in the early 2000s, Socotrans imprisoned in Hadibo were permitted to leave the prison to buy lunch precisely because the sea continued to provide an effective barrier to their escape. Having become reliant on quick and safe air travel, Socotrans were thus distraught when Yemen's national airline relinquished its Socotra routes to a private competitor in 2011. This move ignited protest as energized as the ones calling for the end of Saleh's regime. In December 2011, protesters held signs stating that Yemeni Socotra is in need of return of Yemeni Airlines, and an organizer delivered a speech arguing that Yemeni's financial decision was a crime against human rights. On a distant island lacking even basic medical equipment, the absence of regular controlled flights to the mainland had added a high premium to the value cost of human lives, Socotran lives, sorry. Yemeni did eventually reinstate its Socotra routes until the 2015 embargo on Yemen's airspace imprisoned Socotra once again. During a phone call in May 2015, shortly after Operation Decisive Storm had ended, the friend I mentioned earlier quipped that now he hoped the monsoon would arrive quickly so that it could fully quarantine Socotra before the Houthis and other criminals could reach the island. But after 3 months of complete isolation, Socotrans were short on cooking gas, baby formula, and other staples. Moreover, dozens required urgent medical care such as dialysis, which they could only receive on the mainland. By the fall of 2015, Socotrans were once again demonstrating Hadibo for their right to regular flights, as they had in 2011, while others posted distress calls on social media. In December 2016, a cargo vessel en route from Makalla to Socotra capsized. Nearly 2/3 of its 64 passengers and crew drowned. Several of the drowned passengers were children, including a toddler named Khalid Ahmed. Secutrans denounced the blockade, demanding the reinstallation of weekly flights, and urged their Facebook friends to alert the world that Secutrans were drowning due to the aerial siege. One widely shared meme that I can't find anymore, unfortunately, juxtaposed a photograph of Secutrans at the harbor waiting for the bodies of the deceased next to the photograph of the Syrian toddler, Alan Kurdi, whose drowned body had come to symbolize the global migration crisis. The meme was disseminated under the hashtags "We Are All Khalid Ahmed" and "Break the Siege on Socotra." Subsequently, Yemeni reinstated monthly flights between Socotra and the mainland, but these were often canceled, leaving Socotrans stranded for weeks. Meanwhile, Gulf-based investors began arriving on the island in droves by private plane or charter flights to buy up property and to export Socotra's fish to markets at home. Following two back-to-back cyclones in the fall of 2015, the UAE's Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan Foundation had delivered several tons of food supplies and relief aid by air while renovating the runway in the harbor. When I spoke to the same friend on the day that the boat capsized, he was less flippant about the island's confinement. "Everything is upside down now," he said. "I mean, the fish are flying in the air while the people are drowning at sea." Now, it's not surprising that Socotrans tried to connect their situation to the plight of Syrian border crossers in 2015, but not to the Somalis and Ethiopians drowning at sea. Since the early 2000s, the Somali bodies have washed up regularly on Yemen shores, but with little to no international attention. In the year prior to Khalid Ahmed's drowning, there had been at least 6 boat incidents, resulting in at least 175 Somali and Ethiopian deaths. Despite these perilous sea crossings, migration into and through Yemen has increased during the war. In both 2018 and 2019, the number of migrants and asylum seekers crossing the Red Sea to reach the Arabian Peninsula exceeded the number crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe, a trend that may have continued if not for the land border closures due to COVID. Whereas the majority of Somalis cross the Gulf of Aden, most Ethiopians walk across the desert from eastern Ethiopia to Obok, passing by the Markazi camp on their way. Situated directly across the street from the UNHCR-run camp is this IOM-run migrant reception center for the migrants heading to or returning from Yemen. Tens of these Ethiopian migrants enter the camp daily, searching for food. Djibouti's refugee agency employs Ethiopians languishing at the center to clean up the garbage in the camp, a job the Yemenis consider beneath them. Even some of the Yemeni refugees employ Ethiopian migrants in their homes. A few Yemeni women I know cook extra food for the migrants and invite Ethiopian women into their air-conditioned homes for respite. Their heart aches for them, but what else can they do? A friend told me. "We tell them we are refugees, laji'in, like you," she said, rejecting the border between refugees, displaced, and migrants that the humanitarian industry and the 2 separate enclosures work so hard to maintain. In 2017, UNHCR launched an awareness campaign called Dangerous Crossings to warn those heading toward the Arabian Peninsula of the risks that lay ahead. Featuring multilingual songs, the campaign had reached more than 8 million people via social media by June 2018. Still, the Ethiopians' daily march to the sea continued, even during the summer months when the average heat index inches up to 110 degrees. Ethiopians I've interviewed in Arabic, because it was not their first trip to Saudi Arabia, know of all these dangers, but are desperate for work. That June, dozens of Ethiopians died of cholera on their way to Obok before they even reached the sea. Several young men died within a stone's throw of the migrant reception center, right across the street from Markazi. One of the refugees I know found a body half eaten by wild dogs just behind his tent. It had been so hot that the ground shimmered, like the sea, a friend told me. That summer, it was not the dangerous sea crossing or the war zone that ended their journey, simply contaminated water along the way. The following year, the IOM rolled out a new messaging campaign, now with more explicit images of body bags. The messaging had become more urgent too, instructing the border crossers to choose life, which in fact is exactly what they were doing. Last June, as many as 300 migrants may have died when their boat sank 18 nautical miles off the coast of Al-Mocha. 2 months ago, these now heavily faded images still graced the billboards erected along the migrant route. The Ethiopians I met knew they were heading toward a war zone. They knew the journey wasn't certain. They had been to Saudi Arabia and they had been deported before. But with farmlands drying up, conflict at home, and no paying jobs in sight, they were choosing life. This sea crossing is their only hope for a viable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So I will put everyone up for maybe about 20, 30 minutes of a discussion. We'll introduce Atossa here as our discussant. I just wanted to encourage everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, just to add them in the chat. And in about 20, 30 minutes, you can actually ask it, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me and all of us. These were such illuminating papers, and I really enjoyed reading them, as well as all of the panelists' previous and related work. My questions will actually draw from some of that work as well, because there's so much of it and it's so good. So I think I'll start by talking a bit about how you all three of you have described processes wherein at certain key moments, whether it's a Coast Guard raiding a ship, a refugee not quite knowing where they are in legal terms, or a pirate negotiating a ransom, or transacting with land, we have this moment where sea becomes land and land becomes sea, or at least more land-like and sea-like in these political, symbolic, and even functional ways. And this makes the sea borders more negotiable. View is who.
Atossa, I'm sorry to interrupt. There was a little bit of a cut there with the connection. We just lost those last few sentences.
Okay, I'll start. So what I was going to say is we have sea borders that are in the scenarios that you've all described more negotiable and fungible than land borders. And I was hoping that all of you could say a few words about who this liminality or blurriness of the border ultimately serves and who benefits from it.
I'm going to jump in. I think that in some ways, I mean, my argument is that largely if you have a lot of power, you have a lot of ability to decide where those borders sit. But I also want to, because I've learned from Jatin and I've learned from Johan, Matthew, and Fahad Bishara and others who've worked on precisely the question of those liminal spaces and sort of liminal practices at sea, that in fact there's also the possibility of escape in those jurisdictions. So on the one hand, you do have these incredibly powerful and both literal and metaphoric sense of instruments of the metropolitan powers, whether it's the EU or the US or China, and the naval warships that constantly cruise these particular waters. But on the other hand, you also have people that actually smuggle through those spaces, that you have people that find that escape as refugees do, or engage in piracy or fish illegally, whether they're locals or not. And so I think that there is a kind of a push and pull in here. And although the powerful states tend to be the ones that most benefit from this financially, I think it's not a completely totalizing power. That push and pull, the constant sort of butting up against those jurisdictional forms of practices of violence, and ends up opening up interstitial spaces in which I think it is possible to be a pirate, or it's possible to be a refugee or a smuggler, or indeed engaging in completely illicit trade as well. And so I think that to me, that it's, although my paper was entirely about the use of power, I think it is really important to make that kind of add that kind of caveat to my.
Jatin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I can jump in. Absolutely, and building on Laleh's point, I think precisely in my work, it is about the various moments at which blurriness and also certain kinds of distance become really important, right? And across scales. So and what I mean by that is so when NATO and the EU establish an anti-piracy task force, one of the things that they do is ostensibly kind of say, like, we don't really care about the territorial waters versus exclusive economic zones versus international waters. In fact, like the whole definition of piracy is supposed to be things that happen in international waters. What they do through the UN declarations against piracy is basically blur that line and say it doesn't matter where a ship is taken. And part of that is precisely there we see blurriness as a way of making possible certain kinds of policing, right? But then there's also a way in which blurriness of jurisdictions is about distancing, and this comes to the kinds of relationships that anchor pirates to land, and what made it possible for many of my interlocutors to claim that they were both against piracy and at the same time, profiting from it. So piracy was a hijack and ransom economy, which meant that once a ship was hijacked, you brought it close to shore, and interestingly, to a near cell phone range. So in that sense, the one jurisdictional marker that mattered for piracy to actually operate was cell phone connectivity, because so much of this negotiation happened from, so it wasn't about territorial waters there, but it was precisely about, cell phone towers, right? So it's also interesting to think about what kinds of legal technical regimes come to be the border, and in my case it became cell phones that made that possible. But what that meant was that someone could say, I will provide food and water for these hostages in return for a cut. And then when I would talk to them, they would say oh, pirates are terrible. I'm not a pirate. It is deeply haram to invest in piracy. And I was like, but you're sending food and water there. They were like, no, I'm just sending food and water too, because that person happens to be a relative. And so there's a way in which blurring that made it possible to in a way make claims on profits from piracy, while also saying there is something called piracy, which is bad, which is not me, which is not us. And so I'm also interested in thinking about those kinds of distancing, which have also happened with insurance companies when they make decisions about who has the monopoly on violence at sea currently. And by legalizing private security actors, one of the things that ends up by saying, if you transit through this region, we will give you a discount if you use private security actors. What it does is legalize a form of armed protection that has its own histories, and a lot of it was men who had worked in Iraq and Afghanistan who come and then now are riding on ships and claiming to be legitimate protectors, right? So there's also a way in which this blurriness allows differently situated actors to basically run the show without saying, it's limited liability, right? We will do this without taking on the risk. But at the same time, as Laleh also said, there are possibilities of escape. One of the things that is fascinating viewed from a container ship sometimes is the brazen forms of smuggling that happen in daylight across from, right when you're turning into the Straits of Hormuz from, Iran to Ras Al Khaimah and other places. And I would ask people, how is that possible? I thought smuggling would be this highly illicit thing. And it's like, no, the sea is really big. And I think there is, even though it is narrow, it is simultaneously big, and keeping that in mind is really important here.
Right, so the border between who is a pirate, who's not a pirate, who is acting like a pirate and who's not acting qua pirate, these things also get completely tossed up in the air. I'm sure that this is certainly the case when it comes to the movements of refugees and people who help them move as well. Nathalie, I don't know if you want to comment on that or elaborate on what you were thinking about before.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, as Jatin just said, the sea this is kind of what I was trying to get at for the perspective of the refugees, and is that the sea is both, in a way, it's almost too narrow. So it allowed them to escape Yemen, but they weren't able to escape quite far enough. And yet it's also very big, so it allows them to go back even when they're supposed to. So the Yemeni refugees are supposed to hand in their refugee cards and kind of renounce their legal status as refugees if they return to Yemen for more than 2 weeks at least. And it's configured as the problem of the camp, both from the perspective of the people running it and from the perspective of the refugees themselves, who now question a lot this, the discourse of who is a real refugee, who is a fake refugee, because of how often they come and go and how easy that is for them. But what I'm trying to deal with in my work is also the fact that you have these, I'm interested in the site of Obok precisely because you have the refugee camp, the camp for refugees across the street from the camp for migrants. But people are moving in and out of these categories all the time. And the refugees have been migrants going across these same pathways and crossings. They may now be refugees, but then they will slide into the category of an economic migrant and then come back into the camp as a refugee. And the migrants, of course, themselves, people who the Ethiopians who are called migrants have been refugees or will be refugees and have been moving back and forth through these circuits. What I find so, it's the discourse is interesting to think it's somewhat difficult to use because it's become so normalized that people talk about the refugees and the migrants as these very stark categories, even knowing that, of course, they're taking the same routes and that they're moving in between the categories. And it's really the sea that also allows them more than land borders to have this flexibility between categories, which is why I actually found it very interesting when people in the camp, the so-called refugees, insist that the so-called migrants are refugees like them, that they're all kind of in the same boat and that they're able to, and so what I'm interested in looking at particularly is the daily encounters where people are able to see themselves in that common boat, so to speak, looking past things like race, ethnicity, and other things that also can often divide them.
I think Laleh wanted to respond to Nathalie. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I actually have when you were talking about this kind of a categories of people that the way that it completely changes, that you're a refugee or fake refugee or real refugee or a migrant, it totally reminds me of Palestinians immediately in the aftermath of Nakba in 1948, where the sort of the category under which they were placed and continue to be placed is constantly, it's never a category absolutely or on its own sui generis. It is always relational. And so the Israelis would call them the infiltrators, and UNRWA calls them subjects of UNRWA, but UNHCR does not accept them. They are migrants. Are they the Shatet? And I think that is really interesting because, of course, both power plays into it, but also the ways in which they also try to sort of use these different categories that are imposed on them, often quite violently and quite in a terrible sort of way, and try to sort of find avenues of escape. And so what was really striking about your story for me was the fact that, and the image that you had of the person sort of rowing across Bab el-Mandab back to Yemen, which of course reminds me of all the Palestinians that at least between 1947 and about 1949-50, even into 51, would actually cross the borders from Lebanon or Jordan or the West Bank or whatever into to sort of go and harvest their lands and then leave again and go back to the refugee camp. And I think that porousness is, to me, really fascinating, and obviously really also says something about the sort of the extraordinary kind of brilliance of people trying to deal with incredibly impossible circumstances when they've been stripped of everything, their ability to move, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just one quick thing to that. It's so striking because there's a sense that the refugees they're supposed, I also did some fieldwork in South Korea where Yemenis were called fake refugees precisely because they had not come by boat. I mean, there was the conception that they should have arrived by sea, and instead they were coming by plane. And here in Djibouti, it's almost like, yes, they came by boat, but it was too close of a crossing. The connections are too close, the family connections. And there's a sense that the refugees should only travel one way. So it's okay that they cross the sea to go away from Yemen, but as soon as they cross the sea the other way, they're doing something that kind of negates their, this claim to be a refugee. On the other hand, state representatives are doing that too when they ought not to be, right? I mean, the fact that you have Yemeni government officials entering a camp that's supposed to provide these refugees protection from the state of Yemen is another kind of crossing, you know, that is actually not supposed to be operating, but actually does. And so I think, you know, also taking off of Jatin's work and what you were talking about in terms of power, where you really have, you know, kind of states and people who are in vulnerable positions, trying, you know, attempting the same kind of extensions, so to speak, or you know, just trying to like actually operating, you know, just like the pirates and the insurers, you know, that they seem to be so diametrically opposed, but in fact they're engaging in many of the same acts.
If I may butt in, this all made me also think of some parts of Jatin's book that talk about the uncertainty over who has jurisdiction over pirates. I think your book even opens with a tribunal, a court case being thrown out over lack of jurisdiction. Maybe you could say a few words about how that, whether this helps the pirates, how this affects their business, and how states are sort of dealing with the ambiguity of jurisdiction.
Yeah, so I think there is a way in which, of course, you know, the ambiguity of jurisdiction meant. So one of the things that it enabled was, you know, the fact that there was no clear sense of, okay, here is a pirate, here is piracy, this is how we prosecute it, and then we repeat it across courts. And so, you know, so one of the things that happened was it, to me at least, it made very clear that what was happening was a kind of management. And I think this is very similar to what Nathalie was talking about in Laleh, your work on Palestine, right? That part of this is really about creating these categories and then trying to contain people within these categories and realizing the impossibility of containing them in those categories, which, as we've been, I think, pointing to at times, is productive for subaltern actors, because it allows you to say, well, I am a fisherman, and in fact, you know, but one of the things that was very clear was the inability of certain kinds of crossing, right? So in the Somali case, with respect to piracy, yes, there was all this ambiguity, and yes, in private conversation, and sometimes even public conversation, people by which I mean, like, you know, UNODC and other officials would recognize that there was still a line that a pirate is a pirate, right? So when private security companies were allowed to police seas, there were a number of people who claimed to have retired from piracy and wanted to become coast guards and private security actors. They were picked up by EU boats, and because they were Somali, were on a fishing skiff and had weapons on board, were seen as, you know, kind of de facto, if not de jure, preparing for committing acts of piracy, right? Even if they claimed, look, I'm not a pirate, I used to be one, I'm simply now wanting to protect commercial shipping. That was not possible, right? There's a very clear line, and one that was repeatedly made in the book, of who gets to be the private security actor, and that line was always, for a long time, was deeply racialized as well. It was, you know, white men who had worked in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then were kind of moving towards this, had sent in diploma and degrees, like kind of traced a kinship through these institutions. And increasingly now you have what are called mixed contingents, which include Sri Lankan, Nepali, and again, these are all, you know, travelers with the British Empire, right? So there's a long history why those would be there. So I think there is, you know, so in some ways to think about, like, where, yes, here's all the blurriness, but there are these like incredibly sharp divisions that also happen. And I think in a way, like, part of what I want to do is always sort of push at that and say, what is it what perpetuates this? What does it say about world systems? And I think this gets us to Laleh, what Laleh began with, of like ultimately like these enactments of power and the kind of, you know, various forms of, from Grotius onwards, and like the sea as this imperial stage.
Well, perhaps this next, and I think final question, we'll get at some of that as well. So the part, you all focus on the same region, broadly speaking, the Arabian Peninsula. I was wondering if you could all address the question of whether this liminality, blurring, all these things that you've been describing, is this region particularly conducive to that? These are places where, you know, ports, for example, are largely controlled by DP World, which is a private company operating under the auspices of Dubai's sovereign wealth fund. So that's kind of a weird kind of mix of sovereignties. You also have tons of free trade zones in this region that have been instrumental in bolstering commerce. And now we're seeing these sort of states within states emerging, whether we're talking about something like the Dubai International Financial Center or the future NEOM project in Saudi, which to me, it seems like the Fire Festival, but anyway, that's a different story. You know, people will click their fingers and suddenly there's a new jurisdiction. And it's also a region where ideas about citizenship and nationality are a lot more fungible than they are, say, in Europe or the US. Whether we're looking at states' willingness to denationalize citizens, their unwillingness to naturalize long-term residents, and in the Emirati case, which I've written about quite a bit, the documentation of stateless people with foreign passports, sort of using foreign citizenship as almost a flag of convenience. So, so I know this is a broad question, but what is it about this part of the world? Is it unique to this part of the world? Why are we seeing these things happen here?
I definitely wouldn't say it's unique to this part of the world. I think part of the reason that we see a lot of it here is because these are some of the last places to come out from under former colonial arrangements or protectorate arrangements. And I think that in some ways that sharpens some of these kinds of contradictions, some of these particular kinds of characteristics. The sort of, it's both geographically, politically, historically, and socially. This is a location that has allowed for crossings from all directions, and so I think that historically, both historically and even now, and the sign under which people have crossed into or out of or through or via the Arabian Peninsula has shifted, but this has always been I mean, I think that's actually quite a banal thing to say, because I think all places are places of crossing. But I suppose in some ways, precisely because of those older colonial relations, but also because of the intensified regimes of citizenship and non-citizenship and migrancy, I think the Arabian Peninsula lends itself particularly well to those kinds of blurrinesses, but also those kinds of very sharp divides between citizens and non-citizens, between those in power or those not in power, between the places within places, etc. I think the one thing that I would say, however, is that, again, I would like to reiterate that this is not really unique to the Arabian Peninsula. I think Singapore, for example, is in many ways, I think Eng Sing Ho has been working on something that has to do with Singapore and Dubai for a while now. And I think that says also something about, again, what is it about Singapore? It's a city-state that was a former British colony that continues to be sort of a very close ally, that acts as this kind of a free zone, that it acts as this kind of hub of trade and transit. And so I think all of those things make these places similar. And in some ways, I think they are a kind of a sign of what is to come, rather than something particularly strange or exceptional or weird. I don't know what Jatin or Nathalie would think about that.
Yeah, if I may just add, that's what I find challenging about explaining this merely through imperialism, colonialism, is that they're coming up with new stuff every day, and it's really futuristic as well. And so there's a bit of both, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, and just to build on, yeah, I don't want to exceptionalize this space. At the same time, I think the Singapore example is really salient. And I think one of the things, though, that the Horn of Africa, Arabian Peninsula, Western Central Indian Ocean, allows us to think through is this question of the layering of these multiple forms of placemaking, multiple forms of claim making that are both imperial, but also exceed that, right? And I think this is something that I take from many scholars that on the Indian Ocean that have looked at both this long history without necessarily romanticizing it or without necessarily thinking of it as an alternative, because of course it is precisely these older networks that got absorbed into the emergence of, so without sort of South Asian capital, British expansion in a certain way would not have been possible. Without that imperial history, the rise of oil and like what Bob Vitalis and others have written about wouldn't be possible, right? So one of the things that I think we do get to see are, and I think this is Eng Seng Ho's work on Singapore, Dubai too, is the ways that Indian Ocean histories, imperial histories run together in ways that are neither determined, where neither is determinative, right? Neither is the one that kind of comes, sort of triumphs, but are deeply enmeshed in and entangled in both how we understand the present, but yes, and this kind of deep-seated fascination with the future. And Dubai, which is where I am currently, is right. Just inaugurated the Museum of the Future, and I haven't been yet, but tomorrow I will know what the future entails. But I think that there is something, about thinking with the past, and so yeah. But I don't want to de-exceptionalize this as well, because so many of these things were also part of the story of the Caribbean, for example, just thinking of another world region.
I also wouldn't say it's unique, but I would just add that, I mean, we also have, the Horn of Africa and Yemen are, of course, have such weak states and kind of fractured forms of power and a lot of different, there's taking the case of Socotra, for instance. Socotrans, no one even knows who's in power there. I mean, there are just so many different, there are several militias there right now, or armies. And so one of the things, it's almost like, and then on the other side, the Arabian Peninsula has so much wealth, but it hasn't always been that way, right? And so this is part of it, is that a lot of the, my interlocutors are in the situation they're in now as refugees in the Horn of Africa, precisely because they had family members who'd been migrants in the Horn of Africa earlier, when they were able to earn more money because of colonialism and capital in the Horn of Africa at the early part of the century. So their families had migrated there, then they ended up coming back to Yemen, and it's because I really think it's because of them having roots in the Horn of Africa that these were some of the families who also were able to and motivated to get out and to escape from Yemen, whereas other people, it was a bigger leap for them to do that. And so there's this shift, but really kind of Yemen is this bridge. I mean, when people write about the Arabian Peninsula, they often leave Yemen out of it because it doesn't fit in with the rest of the Gulf states. And so, in some ways, Yemen is situated kind of as a bridge between the Horn of Africa and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula in terms of the fracturing and the weakness of the state, and what that allows people to do or not do, both in terms of migration, but also in terms of basically trying to kind of find ways of escaping sovereign power.
I may just really quick, I sent a note in the chat, but I just wanted to encourage all of the participants, everybody in the audience, you can raise your Zoom hand and we will unmute you and call on you. And you can also add to any questions to the chat.
And if you don't know where the Zoom hand is, I'm sure you do. It's under reactions on the bottom towards the right. I had to remind myself because I've been using Teams for the last 6 months. People are being very shy.
Well, I'll jump in with a question that I didn't get a chance to ask, and it might, get some of the juices flowing. Given that the piracy is, I guess, in the eye of the beholder in some way, what do you all think pirates will look like in 50 years and 100 years? And where is the field going, and what are your predictions?
Pirates writ large, or
recognized, non-sanctioned, not state-sanctioned ones, the rogue ones, yeah.
I mean, so one of the things that increasingly, at least, is happening off the coast of Somalia, at least, is the return to these privatized coast guards as new kinds of fishing concessions are given this time to primarily Chinese trawlers by the Somali and Puntland government. So there's a new turn to what was happening in the 90s that I alluded to in the talk, and talked more in detail in the book about creating these protection, sort of dividing up territories and saying this belongs to this protection group, and if you want to fish here, you pay us. So there's a return to this older protection system. I think with pirates, there's always as I also said, like the tendency for them to either disappear into state-like things and become the state, right? And I do take Tilley's way of thinking about the state as in some ways a kind of piracy, or he calls it a protection racket that that finds some sort of legitimacy. And I do think, many pirates transform into states, and I think that certainly happens and continues to happen in this region and other places. But there's also a way in which, and this is something I'm interested in increasingly, is what happened. What are the reasons to want to escape state recognition, right? And of course, because so much of our, especially for so in that sense, shipping companies are pirates, and these other kinds of. So I'm interested in thinking about the various kinds of corporate forms that are trying to evade state legibility and responsibility. And I think piracy is always this constant scale shifting between these subaltern acts of escape or subaltern claims to inclusion at times within world systems, and then these larger kind of corporate attempts to escape and evade responsibility. So I think, pirates will become tax evaders and corporations, or become states. And I think this continues. So.
I think one of the things that's really interesting for me, and this is so spot on, Jatin, is that until I read Mediterranean in the Age of Philip the whatever, I had no idea that Khairuddin Barbarossa had actually been an admiral of the Ottoman Navy rather than a pirate. And so in a sense, that is also interesting, that he is somehow in the imaginary of a European imaginary. He is this kind of a fearsome pirate figure, whereas in fact, he's actually just the enemy. And who's been made into the pirate. Now, I am going to also say that I find it really interesting the extent to which the discourse of piracy was used, not only the discourse, but also the laws around piracy were used so extensively during the War on Terror against the terrorists as the enemy of all nations. And so I wonder the extent to which those laws could be mobilized against corporations that become pirates. I don't know. What do you think, Jatin?
I think there is perhaps. So I'm looking currently at private security companies, and one of the reasons I'm in Dubai is trying to, this whole shift that is happening with private security companies now registering themselves in the UAE, moving back from maritime security, because of course piracy is not as important, to other kinds of escort and land-based, so infrastructure. So port security is a big. so in the sense, so what I'm wondering is precisely what happens when that kind of pirate figure becomes a corporate figure. Is of course there's a different regime, and that happens. And interestingly, we don't tend to, like, company law and the law of contracts is a very different kind. So part of what I'm hoping is perhaps within the law of contracts we find ways to think about responsibility, and which is not, which is a move away from the logic of piracy, which is the friend enemy, which is why it was very easy to place onto the figure of the terrorist, right? Because these are enemies, but our corporations, like, how do we think about corporations? Are they, and what kind, like, company law, is that about friends or enemies, or is contracts about something else? And so I guess I don't really have a answer to that, but I'm thinking about this, the shift that happens from moving from, a kind of humanitarian legal enemy distinction to corporation contract protection as corporate responsibility. I think we have a few questions. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading these, but sorry, there's some questions in chat that are now appearing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can just jump in. We have, there's one about placemaking, kind of as a frame for understanding one's sense of self in a place. Does that change some of this conversation? Yanis is also bringing in kind of a different time period in the Mediterranean with the Ottoman occupiers. And if anyone would like to voice their question, please just raise your hand. You can do so. We also have a question. I'm wondering about emplacement, given the combination of liminality and very clear and sharp lines of legal jurisdiction and sovereignty. What are the possible terms of knowledge, familiarity, and belonging at sea that don't necessarily take the form of legal, corporate, or state claims to territory?
Okay, if I could quickly jump in on that last one. One of the ways in which I think about the question of belonging at sea, and this was something that I was also struck in Nathalie's comments about the encounter between the sort of Yemeni and the Ethiopian, right? So as piracy expanded, what it required, fishing skiffs were no longer enough to be able to go into farther and farther out. So pirates had to hijack dhows and these wooden boats that go across places where container ships don't. And they're often seen as a vestige of an Indian Ocean past, but many, including Nidhi Mahajan and others, are writing about the contemporary economy of the dhow. And pirates end up on these dhows, hijacking them not for what's on there or for ransoms, but as forms of safe passage. And a lot of my interviews and work was done on board some of these dhows, but also in the spaces of what happens in this form of captivity, which is neither, or which is violent, which is extractive, but is not limited to that, right? It's about also forming a kind of relationality that in this sense came from a shared sense of danger at sea. And I think about the ways that, and perhaps this is an escape that's from the categories, from legal categories, and from that sometimes, and without wanting to romanticize it, but nonetheless, that there are these moments, right? These moments where relationality is made and claimed, either based on longer histories of connection or simply as happened with dhows, over a shared recognition that one was caught in a stormy sea, a realization that the Bollywood movies that dhow captains played because they were from India or Pakistan were very familiar to many Somalis who had spent time, who had grown up with that. So oftentimes they would tell stories of this. And I think holding on to these stories and these moments of cohabitation, I think is also important to think about. Perhaps vocabularies that exceed state, capital, and the legal, without romanticizing them as as ways of thinking about relationality at sea. So I think that question made me think of that.
I think that really hit the spot. And it makes me think of the Camp Collective's film, Gulf to Gulf to Gulf, which is about the movement of dhows across from Asia to the Gulf, to Arabian/Persian Gulf, to East Africa. And I think that those relations that emerged there, which are mediated through the music that the seafarers themselves chose, escapes in some ways the kind of a impersonality and ephemerality of relationship of seafarers aboard those mega ships who could possibly never see each other again, even if they're all Filipino, because their contracts end and they're not attached to a ship. So I think that's really, you're right. It shouldn't be romanticized, but on the other hand, it does escape those sets of kind of exploitative, ephemeral capitalist relations. I want to quickly say something, and then I'm going to shut up so that Nathalie can speak. Something about placemaking. And I think that the sea is a really interesting space for placemaking, because I think on the one hand, the very fact that the movement of humans across the sea does not leave a mark in the same way that it does across land. Nevertheless, there are sort of repetitions in the way that routes are created, and the way the coasts are created, and the way the ports are created, and the way that the routes themselves are imaginary. You know, obviously the maps are constantly shifting, etc. But at the same time, that imaginary actually ends up being quite significant in the imagination of the place, and then in the making of the place. And you see that not only in the nautical maps that are in, you know, the wheelhouse of every single ship, but you also see it in the ways in which we imagine ships going through those spaces. So I think that the placemaking in those places, at least in the middle of the sea itself, rather than on the littoral or on the shore, tends to be very much dictated by the act of imagination as much as anything else. And I think that that's also partially what makes studying the sea so attractive and interesting, and because it does have this constant requirement for us to imagine the unimaginable.
I guess I would just, in terms of placemaking and just going off of what Laleh just said, I mean, there is a sense, and I don't know if this is something that we should just stick with, but there's a sense of the sea having being marked by absences, right? I'm thinking of Hakim Abdelrabzak's work, who talks about the cemetery of the Mediterranean, and then I mean, but part of it also has, yeah, I mean, so the stories of, I mean, one of the, this is just kind of another anecdote, but some of the fishermen who were sitting on the coast one day were talking about their experience and encounters with jinn, who, you know, there's a kind of debate about whether there's more jinn in this area of Oboch, and it's whether, the question is whether they came over from Yemen with the refugees, or whether they were there before because it was an empty space, and when the camp was set up, the refugees actually displaced them. So there's like a double displacement. But people also talked about the jinn, some of the jinn coming from Yemen, and also being afraid to cross the sea, being afraid of drowning at sea. So I'm interested also in the kind of the what you don't see, you know, the losses that happen at sea, and also the invisible crossings, so to speak, right? The kinds of the notions of what crosses here that's not always seen, that's maybe heard. The fact that you can hear the bombs dropping on Yemen from the other coast, even if you can't, you know, don't have a close sense of what's going on if you can't see it. Yeah, I would just, I mean, there's more I could kind of say or think about placemaking, again, in terms of this is, you know, the interconnections and relations between people across the sea, the fact that they have, one of the things that complicates who is actually a refugee or not is also because there's a lot of marriage among these fishing villages in Djibouti and Yemen. And so people were already crossing before anyway. And there were Yemenis living in Djibouti who were not refugees in the typical sense at all, but then ended up going into the camp later on because they have very few opportunities in Djibouti, or things are getting more difficult and they can't go back to Yemen. So now they can go from being, again, a migrant or a Yemeni living in Djibouti to being a refugee in the camp. But yes, I would just say that it's also, we might want to think also about the placemaking, but also the absences, or what were not the things that are lost in these crossings.
So perhaps with this, given that there are not many questions coming in the chat and no one is eager beaver to raise their hand, Atossa, if you have any other questions here, or anyone on the panel, seems like a natural place for us to stop the conversation. So we'll be stopping the recording, and we will stick around for a couple more minutes if there are other questions that people did want to ask.